as an international community, we bear witness to all of these horrors, which are often accompanied with a bit of an outcry that something needs to be done. And more often than not, we look to the UN to do that something. And I've just pulled up some headlines from some recent news articles here to illustrate this type of call, this sort of calling out that the UN must end the horrors of Ethiopia's Tigray war. The international community has to do more, and so on. But when we hear that somebody should do something, what does this something mean? What does doing more really mean? And these are really the questions that we're going to be considering this week. And the ambition for this lecture is to understand what humanitarian intervention is and consider the question of if and when it is ever justified. And I appreciate this can be a little bit frustrating, but I really do hope that you leave this topic with more questions than answers. But before we move on, I did want to make clear up front, something that's really important, and cases that we're going to be looking at, cases of humanitarian intervention are always complex, and they are always historically contingent. And so what we might think of as a horrific situation right now has often been brought about by horrific situations in the past and will likely be followed by more horrific situations in the future. There are rarely goodies and baddies in these stories. And it's interesting that 2 out of the 4 examples that I mentioned in the introduction there, they actually involve 2 former Nobel Peace Prize winners. So Aung San Suu Kyi, she was awarded the prize in 1991 for her non-violent struggle for democracy and human rights. And so she's since refused to recognise the Rohingya as citizens and even defended the military's actions against them. Likewise, Ethiopia's Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, he was the chap that ordered the offensive in Tigray. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize just 2 years ago in 2019. So you can see that trying to identify goodies and baddies isn't always that easy, it isn't always that useful. These situations are extremely complicated and things change. Really importantly, I want you to always bear in mind that these issues, they concern people's lives. And in many cases, they're literally matters of life and death. You might end up meeting people whose families have been in the midst of these conflicts on both sides. And we should always really respect and be sensitive to every side of these stories and those people's experiences. If you leave with anything from this module, I hope it is some humility in the face of the so-called facts. I think more of that would indeed make the world a better place. So, first and foremost, we're going to be talking a little bit about what humanitarian intervention is and some of the theoretical arguments and justifications. So, we're going to start with a bit of a dilemma and recall that the beginning of the state system in the 17th century and stemming sort of from the Peace of Westphalia, state sovereignty and the norm of non-intervention are really cornerstones of international society as we know it. And we talked a little bit last week where we can kind of see the use of force. It's only ever going to be used for self-defense purposes. And I mentioned last week's introduction, the human rights regime really starts to challenge these norms. So we have this sort of long-standing idea, norms around sovereignty and non-intervention, human rights regime, particularly when it sort of codified in law in the late 1940s or in the post-World War II era, we start to see some challenge. So there's some challenge to that long-standing norm posed by the human rights framework. And I have a quote here from Henry Shu's chapter, Henry Shu being an influential person in the human rights literature. He's got a chapter called Limiting Sovereignty, and I think this really raises the question of humanitarian intervention out of human rights quite nicely. So he says that if we do not believe that anyone beyond their own state can reasonably be asked to bear the responsibility of protecting these people against the single most serious threat to their lives, their own states, we do not believe in any practically meaningful way that they have a basic right not to be killed. And so here, Shu is really pointing out the paradox that states are, at the same time, the most dangerous threat to human rights and their protectors. So we've kind of got this two role of the states. They're supposed to be protecting human rights, but it's pointing out that, if human rights are going to be violated, it's probably the state that have something to do with that. And so he's sort of implying in this quote as well that we need some sort of supra-state body in order to keep an eye on the state and come in to protect human rights if the state itself isn't going to do so. Otherwise, human rights really have no meaning. And so from this point of view, human rights violations seem to provide legitimacy for humanitarian intervention, which can really be understood as a right granted to other states to intervene, sort of militarily, within the violating state without its consent. And I've put militarily here because even though humanitarian intervention can take different forms, some softer, others harder, we'll be focusing on cases of military interventions undertaken in the name of human rights. That's kind of the pinch point, or sort of where the issues that we're going to talk about are most problematic. So the first question is whether this interpretation can be justified. So are human rights violations really sufficient to or do they provide a sufficient case for a state to intervene in a state's internal affairs without that state's consent? And so here we're going to rely on our justifications of human rights themselves from last time. And so the first justification for humanitarian intervention, sort of given the definition that we've just outlined there. So the first justification really leads on from the political justification of what human rights we have. So this was from last week, but it looks at the sort of the rights and responsibilities side of the relationship from this sort of other angle. So last week we saw that the list of human rights should only include rights that, if they're violated, will call into question the legitimacy of the state. So human rights are necessary for state legitimacy, and their violation then gives reason for triggering intervention. So in a sense, it is only by protecting human rights that states actually enjoy their sovereignty. But if they fail at this task, either by allowing human rights to be violated or being the active violator themselves, then they forfeit their legitimacy as states, and sovereignty and non-intervention no longer applies. They've kind of given up that right. They've given their right to sovereignty because they are violators. So they sort of lose their legitimacy by virtue of human rights violations. Moral justifications. Now, because moral justifications don't tie human rights explicitly to the state system or any kind of legal doctrine for that matter, they are seen as universally applying to all humans by virtue of their humanity. And so the universality of human rights really means that state borders provide no immunity from international moral actions when the violations of rights within a country are kind of severe enough. And so when life and humanity itself are under threat, we have a moral duty to intervene. And you can find these arguments, well, they kind of date back a little bit in the just war theory literature, but also Kant's moral philosophy and his ideas of perfect and imperfect duties, where perfect duties is where we all have a moral imperative to intervene, with no exceptions, and imperfect meaning there are going to be some practical limits to the duty. So intervention, kind of humanitarian intervention is more like a charitable act. So you do it if you can because there's a moral reason, but you don't have to if you can't afford it, for instance. So we've got the political and moral justifications for humanitarian intervention, and linked very clearly to the justifications that these two issues give rise to when we're talking about human rights themselves. But in the legal positivist case, we all have human rights because the UN Charter and various international covenants tell us we do, and intervention on humanitarian grounds. The legal argument might say it does not breach Article 2.4, and talk a bit about that shortly, and or can be sanctioned by the UN Security Council under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. So there is a legal argument to say that humanitarian intervention is justified because there is some some license of it in international law coming into the UN Charter. And we can really argue about all three of these justifications. In the case of political and moral justifications, you might be asking, well, which rights exactly need to be violated in order for a state to forfeit its legitimacy? Or which moral values are appealed to by human rights, and definitely according to whom. So thinking about those criticisms of human rights that we talked about last week. And also, if intervention is some kind of imperfect duty, what criteria should we use to assess who can afford to intervene? Political justifications and moral justifications, both of these are very slippery. And it's not too far a stretch to see how interventions in the name of human rights might be seen to be humanitarian interventions in name only when we look at humanitarian intervention in practice. So if we're relying on these slippery justifications, there is at least scope for those justifications to be stretched somewhat. How about legal justifications? Now, we might think intuitively that this legal justification is a bit more clear-cut. It's written down on a piece of paper and it's codified in international law. Well, unfortunately, it's not so easy as that because, well, I'll talk about that now. So, I mentioned these articles or these important parts in the UN Charter, so let's have a little look at those in a little bit more detail and have a look exactly what the Charter sets out. And I know this looks like a lot of text which is about to come on, but really it's just for you to refer to on the slides. So here we have the famous Article 2.4, and it sets out that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. Then, Article 2.7 goes on to say that nothing contained in the present Charter shall authorise the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, or shall require the members to submit such matters to settlement under the present Charter. But this principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7. So now we have to ask what on earth is going on in Chapter 7, because we're saying, okay, we've got these sort of ideas of non-intervention, but enforcement measures under Chapter 7 might be okay. So I'll run through this pretty quickly, but yeah, feel free to ask me questions if you want more detail on this. But Article 39 says the Security Council shall determine the existence of any threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression, and shall be taken in accordance with Articles 41 and 42 to maintain or restore international peace and security. Now, the Articles 41 and 42 referred to, these authorise the Security Council to actually use armed force. So the question, is this the sort of legal justification we're looking for when we're trying to justify humanitarian intervention? Well, anti-humanitarian interventionists, I don't know what else to call them, these folks would really point out that the enforcement measures that are talked about here in Chapter 7 are really only concerned with peace and security. And peace and security usually is understood to include the use of force for self-defense purposes or to enforce sort of collective security. But Chapter 7, there's never really any, well, there isn't any explicit mention in Chapter 7 of any enforcement measure for violations of human rights. All they're talking about is peace and security. So people who are not so keen on humanitarian intervention would admit that the UN Charter authorises the use of force for ensuring peace and security, but not for the protection of human rights, even though human rights are part of its purposes. So what might a pro-humanitarian interventionist say, on the other hand? So people who are in favour of humanitarian intervention or think that there is a legal justification for it. So these folks, they would probably come back and respond to say that, well, actually Article 2.4 does not prohibit the use of force for for human rights purposes anyway. So the article requires states to refrain from using force only when that it is against the territorial integrity, political independence of other states, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. And so if we were to pop a genuine humanitarian understanding onto this, it could be argued that humanitarian intervention doesn't result in territorial conquest or political subjection. And far from being against the purposes of the UN Charter, it actually serves as one of its main purposes. So the result of these different interpretations, I suppose, is that we don't really have a unique position on whether there is a legal right of humanitarian intervention, which then begs the question of sort of looking back at the moral grounding of humanitarian intervention. Alas, we are back to that slippery slope. So all of the justifications that we can give for humanitarian intervention are by no means precise. We might have political, moral, or legal justifications for it. We might not. We can pick. We can be critical of each of those arguments. So to say that there is a right to humanitarian intervention, or at least that it is legitimate when a state goes in to protect the human rights of people of another state, it's not so easy to say that this is legitimate. Well, it's not so easy to say that it's legal, and it's not so easy to say that it's legitimate. And now all of this might seem rather academic, but we're going to see why it matters for real for people's lives. And I'm very self-conscious about attempting to tell a few stories about humanitarian intervention, and I'm in no way able to do any kind of justice to the sort of richness and the nuance of these stories in a short time. So I encourage you to go out and do your own research on these cases, but for now I'm going to try and focus on the details of the response to these crises rather than on the details of the crisis themselves. I'm going to try and focus on that sort of international response side of things to a number of humanitarian crises, and the first that we're going to look at is Rwanda in 1994.
In the Gisozi Genocide Museum in Rwanda, Kofi Annan is not a hero, let alone a man of peace. The man who was only Assistant Secretary for Peace Operations during this painful period in the country remains a controversial figure. The former Ghanaian diplomat had repeatedly expressed his regret at the international community's failure in the Rwandan genocide. Despite his efforts, some Rwandans have not forgotten his role and still have difficulties forgiving his efforts in this painful tragedy 25 years later. I cannot say that he left a good legacy to the Rwandans. The only legacy he left to the Rwandans was that we thought the international community existed. But in reality, Kofi Annan showed us that the international community did not exist, rather that it exists only for the interests of the superpowers.
This plan of extermination was a deliberate action that we saw coming, and we watched.
One of the characters that we saw there was the chief peacekeeper in Rwanda, Romeo Dallaire. And Dallaire had been responsible for overseeing the transmission of the new shared government in Rwanda and for delivering humanitarian aid. And in 1993, so a year before the Rwandan genocide, Dallaire was very aware of some major incidences, major massacres and large-scale ethnic violence that had been taking place in the country. And then in January 1994, so very early on in 1994, he sent a fax to the head of UN peacekeeping, so Kofi Annan at the time, and it detailed plans for ethnic extermination, and there was talk of a final solution. Dallaire requested that more personnel were to come to Rwanda to help his mission, and he also called for a stop to arms that were being transported into Rwanda. So he was really warning the international community of a potential genocide. The UN and its Security Council members told Dallaire to just get on with the day job and stick to the peacekeeping mission, stick to the peacekeeping mandate. Months rolled by with debates in the US and Europe about the sort of exact definition of genocide. Security Council members really avoided labelling what was going on in Rwanda as genocide because that would mean that they had to do something. So instead, the atrocities there were being referred to as chaos, civil war, and then eventually they were referred to as acts of genocide. But in the meantime, 10 Belgian peacekeepers were harmed by extremists, and then Belgium withdrew its peacekeeping troops, and around 2,500 peacekeepers were there originally. This was already too few, but after that event, after the events of those 10 Belgian peacekeepers being harmed, that number was reduced to just 275. And so de Laird actually stayed on, but the atrocities continued, and still all the peacekeepers were told to do was to keep the peace, deliver humanitarian aid, don't intervene. And so we have to sort of ask the question of why member states were so reluctant to call the atrocities what they were, genocide. But kind of if you think about this in context, just days before the peacekeeping mission was set up, the US had been involved in the Battle of Mogadishu over in Somalia. Some American soldiers lost their lives and the whole thing was seen as a bit of a failure. So really there was zero appetite from the US in particular, but other Security Council members also, to really take on any form of overseas action. They simply didn't want to kind of pay in dollars or blood for any kind of peacekeeping or intervention. The UN and its members were certainly privy to the knowledge about possible ethnic killings and probably could have done something about it, perhaps prevented the genocide, but they didn't want to carry the burden of responsibility. 5 years later, we have the case of Kosovo in 1999.
These people have been driven from their homes and their homeland. Our mission is very simple and very clear. It is to make sure that they return to their homes and their homeland, to be able to live in peace and security, as should be the right of any civilized human being in our world. Day after day, our campaign against Milosevic continues. We hear this morning that there have been demonstrations against him in Serbia. This shows not just our determination, but that we will be successful in the mission we have set ourselves. Of that, I have no doubt. Bye.
And so that video, we've just seen Tony Blair giving a speech at a Kosovan refugee camp, and I think it's a pretty extraordinary scene. So Blair and Bill Clinton, then the US president, essentially what had happened is that they joined a NATO bombing campaign to stop Serbian atrocities in Kosovo. So there were atrocities for sure, and this time they were recognised by the international community, in this case meaning the UK, US and a bit of France. But this was kind of a demonstration, if you like, of the great powers that they can and will act. And perhaps an element of action in Kosovo was sort of in recognition of their failure to act in Rwanda, and were, possibly they were making up for this past inaction. But the military intervention in Kosovo lasted 78 days. And really, in military terms, it was seen as a clear success. So Slobodan Milosevic had surrendered, the Yugoslav Serbian security forces, they'd withdrawn from Kosovo, and the ethnic cleansing did stop. NATO troops were then deployed on the ground, and they still remain there to this day. But Blair and Clinton really went on to present themselves as humanitarian heroes. And here they are in this picture looking quite pleased with themselves. But this, of course, isn't the full story. A huge part of the story is that the intervention did not get clearance from the UN Security Council. So the intervention that was NATO-led, it went alone, it went as NATO. And now this clearly violates even the more liberal interpretation of the UN Charter. So even if we think that Article 2.4 does legitimise some sort of intervention, we still need to get UN Security Council clearance in order to make that legitimate in a legal sort of sense. So the fact that we didn't have Security Council clearance in this case is clearly illegal in an international law sense. And so there was an investigation into the legitimacy of the intervention, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the conclusions of that report. So here we have the Independent International Commission on Kosovo, and it concludes that the military intervention, so the NATO military intervention, was illegal but legitimate. Illegal because it did not receive prior approval from the UN Security Council, but justified because all diplomatic avenues had been exhausted and because the intervention had the effect of liberating the majority population of Kosovo from a long period of oppression under Serbian rule. But there is reason to be sceptical of this too. So again, I'm going to run through this really, really quickly, but the bombings began after negotiations between the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and the Kosovo Liberation Army appeared to collapse. So there was some sort of negotiating before the bombing, but there was kind of talk that these negotiations and these settlements were not going to be reached. But there is a reason to believe, at least from the records, that there was still a possibility of reaching some kind of settlement agreement in the absence of NATO pressure. Beyond that, the story that we most often hear is that the bombing stopped the ethnic cleansing. So the outcomes, in a way, justify the means. So yes, we didn't have Security Council clearance, but we were able to stop the ethnic cleansing and stop these mass atrocities. But again, this is a bit of a revisionist telling of the story. And again, if you kind of go back to the records, it seems that what amounted to ethnic cleansing really came after the first bombings. And so if you look at the documentation of the trial of Milosevic, when he was brought to the International Criminal Court, you'll see that the crimes that he's actually been tried for relate mostly to post-bombing atrocities. So it's not so clear-cut that actually what was going on before the bombings was ethnic cleansing. They were sure that, there were definitely atrocities, but on both sides. But yeah, kind of the idea that these bombings stopped the ethnic cleansing, that might be a bit revisionist. And the bombings are actually all mixed up in that story. So, well, the legacy of this conflict is also so much more complex than rightful winners and losers. And the legacy of this conflict lives on with real life and death effects today. So essentially, while the intervention was really seen as a triumph in the West, it was really very deeply condemned outside of Europe and the US. The right to intervene in this way was seen as a new form of imperialism. And so what these two cases really highlight is a possible dilemma. And so that on the one hand, you have paralysis in Rwanda, and on the other, you have sort of overzealous intervention or illegal intervention. And I emphasize the word possible here, a possible dilemma. And in 1999, Kofi Annan raised this dilemma in his Two Concepts of Sovereignty. So on the one hand, he challenges those who hold on to the legality of humanitarian intervention, it's illegality, asking, leave Kosovo aside for a moment and think about Rwanda. Imagine for one moment that in those dark days and hours leading up to the genocide, there had been a coalition of states ready and willing to act in defence of the Tutsi population, but the Council had refused or delayed giving the green light. Should such a coalition then have stood idly by while the horror unfolded? So the dilemma on the one side is almost like an institutional legal paralysis. And to the other side of the dilemma, he says, to those who believe in humanitarian as morally justified, Annan asks, is there not a danger of such intervention undermining the imperfect yet resilient security system created after the Second World War, and of setting dangerous precedents for future interventions without a clear criterion to decide who might invoke these precedents and in what circumstances? And so what he's getting at here is that when there is a willingness to intervene for legitimate reasons, like gross violation of human rights, the Charter text could hold intervention back, and that seems inappropriate. Nevertheless, on the other hand, it also seems inappropriate that humanitarian intervention can be conducted willy-nilly. So Annan is sort of saying that there needs to be some kind of balancing between inertia and having a humanitarian intervention field day. But how do we avoid simultaneously the danger of inaction and the danger of illegal action? Because both of these situations really pose a serious threat to the legitimacy and identity of the UN. And this is really where the idea of responsibility to protect, or R2P, comes from. It's about balancing these two sides of the dilemma. And so the responsibility to protect was this new norm that would really try to reconcile Kofi Annan's dilemma. So the norm is still built on the acknowledgement of sovereignty, but the norm really attempts to change its content from sovereignty as control to sovereignty as responsibility in both internal functions and external duties. So what does that mean? Well, so here we're thinking about sovereignty implying a dual responsibility externally. So we're talking about respecting the sovereignty of other states, and internally to respect the dignity and basic rights of all the people within the state. But when a state is either unable or unwilling to uphold this responsibility, then the sort of interventionary measures by other members of the broader community of states might be required. And this sounds hopefully a little bit familiar, thinking back to Schu's reasoning about the meaning of human rights. But there are also some other important aspects of R2P that are probably worth mentioning. So R2P is narrow in scope, and it's limited to the responsibility to protect against 4 crimes, these being genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. So these are the only 4 violations that are deemed permissible to trigger intervention. So we're getting more specificity into the nature of the human rights violations that need to be there in order to sort of legitimise any kind of intervention. However, responsibility to protect is not binding on the Security Council. So the Security Council is going to look at situations brought to its attention on a case-by-case basis. And only force authorised by the UN Security Council is deemed legal and legitimate. So there is no right to intervention here, which sort of sees to the willy-nilly aspect of intervention. So in order for a state to intervene, they have to bring that case to the Security Council. The Security Council votes, passes the resolution, and only those interventions that pass that check, if you like, are deemed legitimate in this case. And so while R2P does seem to tackle the legal ambiguity in interpreting the Charter when it comes to intervention, so here we have a clear, there are clear identifiable human rights violations that can trigger humanitarian intervention. So there is no longer any ambiguity in interpreting Article 2.4. It's here in responsibility to protect as a norm. Kofi Annan's side of the dilemma really suggested that it was the Charter text that's holding action back. So when he was talking about Rwanda, of whether we would sit idly by watching the atrocities, he sort of signals that this was an issue of the Charter text or a legal issue. But really, it wasn't sort of the Charter text that was a problem here. It was the willingness, or rather unwillingness, of states to actually do anything. And so while R2P does address the sort of ambiguities over the Charter text to say, there is this principle, there is this new norm that explicitly recognises the legitimacy of humanitarian intervention so long as we have UN Security Council clearance. It doesn't really address that willingness issue. So, lots of times these countries, or the countries that have the power to do anything, just simply don't do it for other types of reasons. It's not that they're desperately able and willing, and it's the charter text that's holding them back. It's the fact that they're not willing to do anything in the first place. So while we kind of see that, yes, we've got this sort of tackling of the legal ambiguity, UN Security Council authorization, it still requires agreement from the 5 permanent members, and each of these 5 permanent members holds a veto, of course. Now, some would really question how new R2P truly is, and it's perhaps not such a huge surprise that R2P was unanimously adopted by all members of the United Nations General Assembly at the World Summit in 2005. Now, this is just the responsibility to protect in principle, so kind of what it is and kind of what it is supposed to do. But R2P isn't just words on a page. The Security Council has relied on R2P in relation to lots of humanitarian crises, but one of those, and perhaps I'm not going to say the most important, but one of the most important being the crisis in Libya in 2011.
Thursday, February 17th. Thousands of Libyans come out onto the streets. 2 days earlier, a small peaceful demonstration for human rights had been bloodily suppressed by the Gaddafi regime. Now, crowds several times larger were demanding his downfall. No one knew what to expect or how the security forces would respond. But this was the start of an uprising. By the end of the day, Libya's streets were covered with blood.
And as a bit of background to the Libyan case, in March 2011, the Security Council responded to violence in Libya by unanimously passing Resolution 1970. And 1970 specifically referred to the responsibility to protect. It demanded an immediate cessation of violence. It established a political process and imposed targeted sanctions, and then it referred the situation to the International Criminal Court. But when the Gaddafi regime failed to comply, the council then authorised the use of force to protect civilians from imminent danger. And this was unprecedented. And this resolution, Resolution 1973, it enforced a no-fly zone and an arms embargo. And to reiterate, this was the first time in the Council's history that it had authorised the use of force against a functioning member state for humanitarian protection purposes. But the details are also really important. So Resolution 1973, it authorises member states acting nationally or through regional organisations to take all necessary measures to protect civilians and civilian populated areas under threat of attack. But super importantly, it prohibits putting troops on the ground. Now, this resolution was broadly supported by NATO members. The no-fly zone was also supported by the African League. And I think it's reasonable to argue that this intervention was probably justified because it seemed plausible, at least, that it could prevent what might have been a massacre in Benghazi. But this isn't the intervention that actually played out. And what we had instead was a kind of Resolution 1973 plus. In reality, the crisis in Benghazi seemed to be settling, and other groups in the region seemed to think that a ceasefire between Gaddafi and the opposition looked at least possible. However, NATO wasn't happy and persisted supporting and arming the rebels until Gaddafi was captured and killed 8 months later. There was really a kind of widespread perception that NATO had stretched or even violated the parameters set out in Resolution 1973. So even though the UK and France in the main claimed they had global support, that was for the real 1973, not this one. So the African League opposed the action, so did the BRICS countries, and even other NATO countries weren't so keen on it. So it seemed that this 1973 plus intervention, it seemed that this went from protecting civilians with a no-fly zone to really sort of active participation in a rebellion, which, indeed it finally succeeded with the death of Gaddafi in October. But really, this Libyan example brings up the same types of questions as Rwanda and Kosovo. And it is whether the decision to intervene or not is really ever based on some kind of humanitarian intent. Now, previous connections between Tony Blair here, but the UK government and Gaddafi are well known. And doing some of my own research on this, after the revolution, journalists actually discovered some documents in Tripoli charting how UK and Libyan intelligence services had been conducting joint operations during the Blair years. And sort of letters that were written between Blair and Gaddafi, but definitely some reports and evidence that the Libyan intelligence agency was permitted to operate in the UK. And these papers really show how folks that were deemed to be dangerous to both parties, they were allowed to be kidnapped by Libyan agents in the UK and then flown to prison in Libya where they had been allegedly tortured. So we're almost sort of like, outsourcing a bit of torture. So allowing these folks to be captured in the UK, shipped back to Libya where they would be ill-treated. So the UK at this time, they weren't so troubled by the human rights abuses that had been sanctioned by Gaddafi back then. So it seems that in Blair's day, at least, the UK quite liked Gaddafi, but when they no longer had a use for him, he was out. And if you're interested in these weird and wonderful connections and how sort of the West used Gaddafi, I recommend that you check out a BBC film by a journalist called Adam Curtis. The film's called Hypernormalization, and I think I put the link on the reading list, but I'll put it in the slides as well. How about France? Well, according to a departmental report by the French Ministry of Defence, 90 million euros of actual deliveries were on the roster of France's arms exports to Libya. And this was just in 2010, just a year before the intervention. So in January, and this is just 1 month before the onset of the revolution, Gaddafi received the last batch of 1,000 missiles, and this was reported in Le Monde. So again, it appears that France wasn't so offended by the repression and torturing of the Libyan people then either, and this is, just a few months before the intervention. So you might have to sort of ask or question what's really changed. And then just 2 days after the Battle of Tripoli began, this headline appeared in the business section of the New York Times. And the story goes on to suggest that a new government with closer ties to NATO might be an easier partner for Western nations to deal with when it comes to oil. And there was also speculation that there might be even more oil in Libya than anyone knows because of the restrictions placed by the Gaddafi government. So, now he's out, there's an opportunity to go in. Kind of considering these issues, it's quite difficult to take seriously a genuine humanitarian motive for the use of violence in the Libyan case. And perhaps the humanitarian motive is, in Chomsky's words, just a new pretext to justify intervention based on a much more traditional conception of national interest. And I don't think that there's necessarily an evil mastermind behind all of this. I imagine if you were to ask Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, David Cameron, and Nicolas Sarkozy when they went to Libya, I'm sure they would say it was for humanitarian reasons, or at least humanitarian motives will be in the mix. But the human brain, I think, is quite good at post-rationalizing, and I think it's difficult to take seriously a genuine humanitarian motive here. And now I want to return to some of the ideas from last week and see how post-colonial ideas of human rights have implications on the way we might think about the justification of humanitarian intervention. So last week I introduced the idea of human rights as a site of power. And for skeptics, humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect are suspected, or at least suspect, because they reproduce structures through which the liberal West wishes to impose the liberal peace on the non-liberal world. And this critique really has a number of angles, and hopefully they'll resonate with the discussion from last week. So taking this as a starting point, we can think about, firstly, well, in the language of humanitarian intervention, an international community is to take over the protection of human rights when a state fails to fulfill it, or when the state actually engages in their violation. But this idea that there is an international community ready and waiting to take up that role if the state fails in its responsibilities, it presupposes the existence of a meaningful international community, in whose name this intervention might be carried out. And supposing that we follow the general standard that only the UN Security Council is the legitimate body to deal with these questions, well, the UN itself doesn't have a military force. So essentially, states providing these forces have to decide about intervention at the national level. So who is going to have the resources to intervene? Most likely the richer Western states. And this might be quite troubling because it runs the risk of giving legitimacy to a few powers to shape societies in light of their own values and images, which according to Pratap Mehta here is a form of colonialism. So this idea that we've got an international community that's going to take on this role of responsibility, this by virtue of the people or the states that are going to be able to do that pragmatically, runs the risk that it is spreading their own values and images. And again, that kind of taps into these debates around colonialism of human rights. Second, again, we're linking back to those ideas from last week. We have the construction of the non-Western world as the other. And we can see that this is replicated in the nature of discourse around humanitarian intervention. So again, for skeptics, humanitarian intervention pretends to protect human rights, but in reality, it's eroding them because it's built on the helplessness of the victim, who is unable to act by themselves unless a saviour comes in from afar. And Frederick Maigret argues that the discourse of humanitarian intervention really constructs victims as essentially passive, depoliticised, and in need of international intervention. So the victim here is cause, object, but never actor or subject. And again, this resonates with justifications of colonialism, protecting vulnerable groups from their leaders, but as a consequence, humanitarian discourse is potentially doing away with the political rights that it claims to protect. And this then links to the third critique that really comes out of the literature on feminist IR theory, which takes a critical look at the meaning of protection in humanitarian intervention. And we see the idea of protection, at least in policy debates, it's accepted as a pretty neutral or a natural thing. Responsibility and sovereignty tend to be the contentious elements, but protection is seen to be pretty clear, pretty obvious. But now feminist IR theorists would challenge this, and instead they'd argue that the protection language is gendered, which raises all sorts of concerns about how power is operating through these interventions. And Anne Orford is just one author who argues that humanitarian intervention narratives these are structured in a way that the hero role cannot exist independently of a helpless, feminized other in need of rescue. And so within these narratives, the benevolent masculinity of the protector is dependent on an opposite, brutal masculinity that sort of poses a threat to the human rights of folks who are incapable to come to their own defence. Now, interestingly, Orford goes on to argue that intervention narratives can also take an imperialist turn where Western women can also sort of imaginatively step into the powerful role of protector, but only if we are willing to sacrifice others to the feminine role of pitiful victim. So countries subjected to intervention sort of become spaces for action where white men have the freedom to create ideal worlds, and white women then can step outside of the usual protected role for a bit to participate in the civilizing mission. And I'm using some of Orford's words here, but essentially what she argues is that protection narratives reproduce power, gendered power imbalances, and that are also racialized power imbalances too. And finally, and perhaps this is even more problematic, is the fact that this humanitarian intervention is targeting certain states and not all states. And as Mohammed Ayub puts it here, the problem becomes more acute when these representatives of the international community choose targets for intervention selectively while ignoring human rights violations of equal or greater magnitude elsewhere. So what we have is not really a global, but a partial humanitarian order, which is confined to so-called rogue states. And we can think through the consequences of that for the state system and sovereignty in general. But talking about selectivity, the example of Rwanda comes back to mind, where the so-called international community really stood by as the genocide unfolded. There are other cases, and Ayub gives lots of examples, but one example is the intervention in northern Iraq, where there was a decision in 1991 to create a safe haven for the Kurds in Iraq, but not in Turkey, where human rights of Kurds were being violated, with equal severity. So again, perhaps we can question the humanitarian sincerity of the intervening powers. And I suppose we might put these criticisms, at least the selectivity one, down to the feasibility and kind of pragmatic reasons for not intervening. And clearly, contexts and actors vary. They vary hugely, and it seems sort of sensible that consideration of the end goal should factor into things. If there's clearly no prospect of success, then the whole thing would be futile. But what critics like Ayub have a problem with is the selectivity in cases that seem to have the same sort of possibility of success, but where some are enforced and others are neglected, and the only real difference between the two cases being political interests and diplomatic ties that are at stake. So really this kind of selectivity goes back to that double standards idea. So some states, even outside the liberal West, they can violate human rights and they can defy UN Security Council resolutions pretty much without any consequence. So long as you are one of the big powers or a friend of one of them, then you don't need to worry, you shouldn't worry. So really this kind of partiality criticism, it delivers another blow to the legitimacy of humanitarian intervention. And it seems that humanitarian intervention really sort of condemns some and absolves others for political interests rather than moral reasons. And that is why, for those who challenge humanitarian intervention, the doubt about its moral foundation and the fairness in its practice are sort of clear signs that humanitarian intervention is another form of colonialism. Those who view humanitarian intervention as neo-colonialism would insist that it's not only moral and ideological interests that are behind humanitarian practice, but also economic interests. Well, we started justifications for humanitarian intervention in the face of, unbearable injustice, situations that cannot leave anybody morally indifferent. So what do we do? What lessons can we draw from the past experiences for the situations that we face today in Tigray, in Myanmar, and the humanitarian crisis that comes next? So even though we've seen criticisms of humanitarian intervention, these folks don't necessarily disagree with people who are pro-intervention, that there isn't always, or there can't ever be, a moral case for intervention. But when is humanitarian intervention ever justified? And what would be the sort of implications of that justification for the type of interventions that ultimately get implemented? Well, it's a big question, and I'm not sure on what the answer to that is, but I'm going to give you some reflections on perhaps what I think of humanitarian intervention. The question, I guess, that I'll leave you with is whether humanitarian intervention can ever be justified through the discourse of human rights. And I think that's really the question that these critics are grappling with. And I'll leave it to you to think about that for yourself. What do I think? Well, I think in an ideal world, there's certainly room for humanitarian intervention to be justified. And perhaps in an imaginary world where we have disinterested states and we have good reason to believe that a country is oppressing its people in extraordinary ways and that the intervention will have a positive effect, or at least we have reason to believe that it will have a positive effect, then I think humanitarian intervention, well, it's potentially a good idea. But in the real world, these factors do not apply at all. I don't think there is one disinterested state. So what do we then do? And I've sort of grappled with this question in the process of writing this lecture. But what do we do when we see gross violations of human rights? Is there any humanitarian intervention that could be useful? I think, perhaps no-fly zones could be useful. Perhaps we should be much more focused on supporting preventative interventions and diplomacy at the regional level. But even then, the end goals aren't always super clear. And then there's the question of sort of do no harm. Is it better to do nothing? I'm not saying it's better to do nothing because, that option is amazing. But perhaps in some instances, doing nothing is better than intervention. Intervention could be and is often worse. But I think, and wrapping up the whole course here, but I think the best way to avert humanitarian crises is probably not to participate in them. What do I mean by this? Well, we often see sanctions that are imposed on countries that violate human rights, but this often hurts the people, not the violators. So are sanctions really a good tool to use when we're trying to penalise human rights violators? Probably not. What do we do instead? How do we actually penalise the violators, not the people? Follow the money. Wealth and power often go hand in hand, and there's a lot that we could do, well, a lot that Western institutions could do to mitigate human rights abuses, but opening up transparency in finance and tax havens, this is just one example. Think about where the money goes and think about how that sort of facilitates power in these cases. And another aspect of world politics that's important is clearly global economic governance. Austerity, liberalisation, conditionalities, these sorts of things can create economic instability that really set light to political instability. And interestingly, many of the horrific humanitarian crises that we've talked about today, these were actually preceded by, or at least coincided with economic crisis, and this was certainly the case in Rwanda and in Iraq. And these economic crises are really not talked about, but it's probably a lot simpler and cheaper and better from a humanitarian standpoint to address these economic crises, really to prevent the seriously damaging political effects they can have. But these underlying causes are never addressed by humanitarian intervention. And you've got to ask the question, why is that the case? If states really do have humanitarian intentions when they intervene, why aren't these sort of more fundamental underlying causes ever part of the story? And lastly, the most blatant of all, if you want to stop humanitarian crises, don't participate by fueling them. And here I just have some figures to illustrate the point. Why wasn't there any talk about intervention in Yemen? Well, you have to look at the commercial interests at stake. So here we have arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other coalition members from Western countries, including the US, France, and Canada. Probably worth mentioning that Joe Biden has frozen arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and it's officially cut American support for the Saudi coalition. That was earlier this year. But, the point remains. We can see that the sort of commercial interests and the profiteering from war, and so this, could also play a role. If you want to stop humanitarian crises, stop participating in them. Don't fuel them. So what can we really take away from all of this? Well, I've just got a few points that for me I think are important takeaways. But humanitarian intervention is really fraught with disagreement. Does humanitarian intervention protect human rights, or does it actually politicize or even weaponize human rights as a means to some other self-interested end? Responsibility to protect was an attempt to kind of overcome some of the inherent challenges of humanitarian intervention in principle. Whether it has been successful in practice and whether it has much of a future is open to question, and I'd kind of encourage you to consider that question. And finally, many philosophical and practical questions remain, to which I would say there is no right answer. And this is why we need and should demand from our leaders humility in the face of the so-called facts. And on that note, we have come to the end of the introduction to world politics. I really hope that you've had the opportunity to really challenge and defend your own ideas and your own views, as well as develop new ones. Take care and be kind to yourselves and others. Goodbye from me.